First of all, look, there's no books for young boys. We have abandoned them. This idea of boys will be boys, we just kind of let them go.
But that takeaway ignores the nuance. Those criticisms applied only to specific portions, not the entire case. So the idea that everything was thrown out or completely discredited just isn't accurate. At the same time, Baldoni's side has its own momentum building. Several headlines highlight that parts of his legal strategy are moving forward, especially the defamation claims, particularly the one involving a former publicist. That case could become significant because it may lead to the release of private messages or communications that haven't been seen yet. If those messages suggest coordination or misleading statements being shared with the media, it could shift the narrative in a big way. The core legal distinction here is important. Saying someone is difficult to work with is usually considered opinion, which isn't defamation. But making specific factual claims, especially serious accusations, can cross into defamation territory if they're false and damaging. So the outcome of that case will likely depend on exactly what was said, who said it, and whether it can be proven. There's also a broader layer to all of this involving media coverage and online discourse. Different audiences are drawing very different conclusions depending on how deeply they've followed the case. Some are relying on headlines, while others are digging into filings and rulings, which leads to very different interpretations of the same events. And then there's the side story involving subpoenas and online commentators, including Paris Hilton and even smaller creators. That part shows just how wide-reaching this case has become, spilling beyond the courtroom into media, commentary, and public perception. Overall, the situation is still unfolding. The judge isn't ending the fight, he's organizing it, narrowing it, and making sure it proceeds in a more focused and legally sound way. The real outcomes will come later as these surviving claims move forward and more evidence potentially comes to light. They didn't include him, and honestly he jokes it off saying maybe it's because, sure, money talks, but a fresh head of hair might win over a jury. Jokes aside, he circles back to the legal updates and what the judge is actually doing here, clearing out the clutter before the bigger, more ing of the case begins, possibly even setting the stage for whether parts of Blake Lively's case could be dismissed later on. One of the biggest takeaways from the latest rulings is that Blake Lively's team hit a wall when trying to access third-party data. A large part of her strategy involved subpoenaing social media accounts and online creators, hoping to gather evidence that might support claims of coordination or a smear campaign. But the judge largely shut that down. Many of those subpoenas were either resisted successfully or never strongly enforced, limiting how much outside digital evidence her team can actually use. That outcome is being seen as a major win for online creators. The court essentially reinforced that people who comment on public cases, especially anonymously, aren't automatically subject to being pulled into legal battles. If there isn't strong, specific justification, they can push back against subpoenas and often succeed. In simple terms, just talking about a case online doesn't mean you can be dragged into it. The argument from Lively's side seemed to suggest that certain creators might have been influenced or coordinated with Baldoni's legal team, specifically his attorney. But that idea didn't gain much traction. The judge treated it more like an overreach, a fishing expedition without enough concrete backing. As a result, most of those attempts quietly failed. No major penalties, no dramatic rulings, just a clear signal to scale it back. This also highlights a broader point about content creation. Most creators build their audiences on credibility. If they consistently exaggerate or mislead, people stop watching. So while headlines and thumbnails might be designed to grab attention, there's still an underlying pressure to stay grounded in facts. That's part of why the idea of widespread coordination didn't really hold up. It clashes with how most independent creators actually operate. The speaker also reflects on trying to stay balanced in coverage, looking at both sides and even exploring possible explanations for why someone might make certain claims, without immediately jumping to extremes. That kind of approach can sometimes put a creator in a gray area, not fully aligned with either side, which might explain why they weren't targeted the same way others were. Or it could simply be randomness, platform differences, or visibility. Stepping away from the case, the conversation shifts to a major real-world event: widespread No King's Day protests across the United States. Demonstrations reportedly took place in thousands of cities, from major hubs like New York, Chicago, and Boston to smaller towns, drawing large crowds. The protests centered around concerns about democracy, civil rights, and government authority. What stood out was the scale and, in some places, the lack of violence. For example, in New York City, it's noted that there were no arrests related to violence during the protests, which is being framed as a significant moment given the size of the gatherings. At the same time, the speaker points to recent tensions and incidents involving law enforcement and immigration authorities, which have contributed to the urgency and emotion behind these demonstrations. Overall, the tone reflects two parallel stories: one inside the courtroom, where things are being narrowed, clarified, and prepared for bigger decisions; on one outside, where public reaction and broader societal issues continue to unfold in real time. What's really striking about the No King's Day protests is just how massive they were. We're talking about an estimated 8 million people, across roughly 3,000 cities in every state. That puts it among the largest single-day demonstrations in American history. No matter how you slice it, that scale is significant. But what's almost just as noticeable is the reaction from critics trying to downplay it. You see comments like, "More people went to Costco that day," or "It's only a small percentage of the population." And it's like, what are we even comparing here? Those arguments miss the point entirely. A protest isn't meant to include everyone. It's meant to show organized, collective action. And by that standard, this was enormous. There's clearly a segment of people who just don't want to acknowledge what's happening, whether it's dismissing the numbers or shifting the conversation. The effect is the same, minimizing something that, historically speaking, is a big deal. This wasn't just another weekend event. It reflects a broader moment of public frustration and mobilization. At the same time, there's a growing sense of unease about where the country is heading, especially with foreign policy. There are increasing reports of deeper military involvement overseas, with talk of boots on the ground and a potentially expanding conflict in the Middle East that raises serious questions about cost, about purpose, and about the human impact on the people being sent into those areas. And that tension shows up in everyday life too. You hear calls to support the troops, which of course is important, but it also raises a harder question. What exactly are they being sent to do, and why? Supporting individuals doesn't automatically mean agreeing with the decisions that put them in harm's way. Then there's the frustration with leadership at home, when people see elected officials appearing disengaged, whether it's checking the stock market during legislative sessions or benefiting financially while major issues go unresolved. It feeds into a sense that priorities are out of alignment. People want urgency. They want the same intensity from leadership that they feel in their own lives when something is wrong and needs fixing immediately. On top of that, global events continue to add fuel to the fire. Reports of restricted religious access, journalist safety concerns, and ongoing military actions all contribute to a perception that fundamental rights and international norms are being strained. These stories, whether fully verified or still developing, shape how people understand the broader situation and who they trust. All of this ties together: the protests, the political frustration, the concerns about war into a larger picture. People are paying attention, speaking out, and trying to make sense of rapidly unfolding events. Some see it as a turning point, others dismiss it. But either way, it's clear that something significant is happening, both at home and abroad. Good morning, everyone, and happy Monday, March 30th, 2026. Let's get you fully caught up for your morning commute, because there's quite a bit to unpack from Friday and everything that's developed over the weekend. We're starting with major updates in the ongoing Justin Baldoni versus Blake Lively case, which has continued to gain traction online. Over the past few days, there's been what many are calling a significant win for content creators who have been closely following and discussing the case. The judge has begun clearing items from the docket in preparation for some very important upcoming filings, particularly the response to the motion for summary judgment. If that term sounds complicated, don't worry, I'll walk you through what it means and why it matters in simple terms. What's especially interesting is the tone of the judge's recent comments. Some of his statements appear to favor Baldoni's position, while others push back on arguments from his side. Because of that, both sides are already claiming small victories and framing the rulings in their favor. I'll break down exactly what was said and why each side believes it's coming out ahead. There's also a personal update mentioned in the coverage. Paris Hilton was reportedly hospitalized for 21 days due to a serious stomach issue, possibly a burn or related complication. The good news is that he seems to be recovering, so we'll briefly touch on that as well. Now, looking more closely at the legal developments, one of the key rulings involved a motion to dismiss counterclaims tied to Stephanie Jones. The judge granted the motion in part and denied it in part, which has actually become a consistent pattern in this case. Instead of delivering sweeping decisions, the court is carefully weighing each argument, certain aspects while holding back or rejecting others. This kind of split ruling suggests the judge is trying to keep the case balanced as it moves forward rather than decisively favoring one side at this stage. Another major point of contention involves the handling of evidence and witnesses. Baldoni's legal team has accused Blake Lively's side of document dumping, essentially overwhelming them with a massive amount of material. At the same time, Lively's team has reportedly submitted an extensive list of potential witnesses so broad that critics argue it lacks focus and may be strategically excessive. Because of these issues, the judge granted Baldoni's side an additional week to meet pre-trial deadlines, giving them more time to review everything properly. Outside of the courtroom, there's also been an interesting discussion happening among viewers and followers. Some people have reported that they were unexpectedly unsubscribed from the channel and had to resubscribe. While there's no clear evidence of anything intentional or widespread, it's something people have noticed enough to mention, so it might be worth taking a second to double-check that you're still subscribed if you follow this kind of content regularly. Later in the episode, we'll shift focus to a much heavier topic: reports of troops being deployed to the Middle East. This raises serious questions about what comes next, especially with the possibility of escalating conflict. There's concern about what this means for service members being sent overseas, their families back home, and the broader direction of foreign policy. It's a complex situation, and will take time to break it down thoughtfully. For now, that's your expanded overview of what's happening. Let's dive deeper into each of these stories and make sense of it all. It's kind of like an umpire stepping into total chaos during a full-on baseball brawl, players charging the mound, pitchers sprinting in from the bullpen, catchers going at it, everyone involved, even the mascots. And in the middle of all that, the umpire isn't picking a side right away, they're just trying to break it up, separate people, and figure out what actually happened. That's basically where the judge is right now, trying to calm things down and sort through a messy situation, not declare a clear winner yet. That's why it's important to look at both sides of the story. I get that it can be frustrating, but perspective really shapes how people interpret what's happening. It's like that idea often attributed to Wayne Dyer: when you change how you look at things, what you see changes too. And that applies here. There are definitely parts of the ruling that don't look great for Justin Baldoni's legal team, but there are also elements that work in their favor. A lot of online discussion spaces, like pop culture forums, seem to lean pro-Black lively. And there's an interesting pattern. The less closely people have followed the details, the more likely they are to assume Baldoni must be at fault. That tends to come from people reacting to headlines rather than digging into the full case. For example, some summaries claim the judge called Baldoni's lawsuit legally frivolous and factually baseless and sanctioned his lawyers. But that's only a small piece of a much bigger picture. When you look deeper, the ruling is more nuanced. Yes, the judge did criticize certain claims and said some crossed the line into being legally weak or improperly filed. But that criticism was limited to specific parts, not the entire case. Blake Lively's team pushed for sanctions, essentially asking the court to penalize Baldoni's side financially for filing what they considered baseless claims. However, the judge didn't go that far. Instead, the outcome was more of a formal warning than a real punishment. Some claims were labeled objectively unreasonable, and the lawyers were reprimanded, but there were no major consequences like paying legal fees. It's less you're punished and more knock it off or it could get worse. A warning shot, not a final judgment. The judge focused on a few key issues. One was a civil extortion claim where certain individuals included in the filing had no clear connection to the alleged wrongdoing. Another involved interference with business contracts, where only a couple of parties actually had a legitimate relationship tied to the claim, while others were included without solid legal grounds. So the problem wasn't necessarily the existence of the claims themselves, it was how broadly and loosely they were applied. That distinction really matters. It's not accurate to say the entire case was thrown out as frivolous. Instead, the judge is narrowing things down, trimming away weak or unsupported parts while allowing the stronger arguments to continue forward. So while one side may claim a headline victory, the reality is much more balanced and still very much in progress. The issue really comes down to how the claims were structured. Some of Baldoni's arguments included extra parties who probably didn't need to be part of those specific claims. That's where the judge took a shoe-nut with everything, but with certain parts that were stretched too far. In other words, not everything crossed the line into something punishable. And that's actually where Baldoni's side gets a meaningful win. The defamation claim, for example, is still alive. The judge essentially said that even if it might not succeed later, it isn't so unreasonable that it deserves punishment right now. He also acknowledged that arguing defamation through a conspiracy angle is legally valid, so it can't just be dismissed as frivolous. That explains why the judge's response was relatively light. Yes, mistakes were made, and yes, some claims violated Rule 11 standards, but the court also made it clear that those weaker claims didn't create a major burden or significantly disrupt proceedings. Because of that, there was no justification for heavy penalties like forcing one side to pay the other's legal fees. Instead, it was more of a formal warning, a clear knock it off, rather than a serious punishment. A simple way to understand it is this. One side brought a case that included both solid